Welcome to Surreal Noir. I'm your host, Kate Laity. It was another hot, sunny day in Los Angeles where the clouds had taken a powder and struck out for Catalina or the north. It didn't matter to me, as I kept the shades pulled anyway, with the window cracked a bare inch in a fruitless attempt to assuage the throbbing dance party in my skull. I had the bad luck to be drawn into a quick game of stud with Eddie and a couple of his palooka friends in the back room that lasted until dawn, by which time my pockets sported little more than fluff. It didn't help much that I knocked back one too many gimlets to ease the pain of losing hand after hand. I had just decided to indulge in a little hair of the dog to cut the carpet on my tongue when a peremptory knock at the door signaled the arrival of a paying customer. At least I hoped it did. I hadn't had so much as a jealous husband that week. The life of the honest P.I. was always close to the bone, but I couldn't be anything else. It's open. A woman walked in and I knew I'd be buying whatever she had to sell, even if she wasn't a paying customer. She wasn't some glamour puss from the silver screen. Her gray suit was modest and well cut, though its simplicity made her flawless legs even more apparent. I caught a whiff of real French perfume as she took a seat before my desk and looked me over with a frankness that made my hand itch for a comb. A compatriot of mine recommended you. I could hear the French in every vowel. That's good to hear. Some society dame? I took in her nails, lacquered jungle red, and the coiffure under the fancy little hat. Sure I had her number. She laughed. A boxer. Amthor Jules, better known as Jukebox Jules, I finished. She ran with a rough crowd. Pretty friends you got. She smiled and drew a pack of Gaulois from her satin clutch, offering me one before she lit up. We all wear disguises. You wouldn't guess from this, the woman gestured with the cigarette, but I've worked as an acrobat and as a hypnotist plant and much more before the war. Her face clouded. Lost some folks close to you. Myself. Her smile was rueful, but her eyes looked hard. I'm dead, you see, but that's not really why I'm here. I need you to find someone. I leaned back in my chair, trying to hide my fascination. First time a ghost has sought my services. Can't you just float around the city and find them? I may be dead, but I'm no ghost. I was in the resistance, Ibaris. I knew I recognized that perfume. A concoction called Shocking, or was it Le Shocking? The end of the war was not as neat as the newspapers pretended. Not all the work was finished when those bugs were squashed. A lot of things disappeared during the war. Jewelry, artifacts, art. So you're here undercover to look for something. Definitely intrigued now, though I tried to keep myself from salivating. After all, it was beginning to sound like volunteer work. Time for all good men, etc. L'écran transparent. I frowned. My French was a bit rusty. Transparent. Well, there's a club in West Hollywood that might... She shook her head. You misunderstand me. You have not read your Breton. I think one translates them as the Great Invisibles. That's going to make them hard to find, I deadpanned. But she didn't even offer me a polite simper. Have you heard of the great god Pan? Pan as in panic? I read some Greek mythology as a kid. Nature guy, right? Half man, half goat. Like most of them. She leaned forward in her chair. The heart-shaped face emphasized the dark eyes that burned under meticulously plucked brows. Pan is much older than the Greeks. I pondered this. Etruscans? Older. I shrugged. I thought that meant cavemen. Before humans, probably. They perhaps arose from the earth itself, or je ne sais pas. They came from the stars. The great invisibles have watched over this world for millennia, nudging us along toward insights and improvements. So was the war part of their plans? I would humor her for a while, but it was beginning to sound cracked, and it was far too early in the morning for indulging that kind of hooey, however nice she looked in that Schiaparelli ensemble. Anger flashed in her eyes like heat lightning in the Mojave. Humans squander every gift they receive in petty squabbling and childish greed. The great ones abandon the old world for a time, seeking new populations they hope to be untarnished by these weaknesses. I suspect they will soon be disappointed. So why not sit tight and wait for them to return? Something in her expression became guarded. My friends and I wish to make an appeal to them directly. Oh, talk to the bosses, as it were. Something like that. The friendly open look returned, which put me on my guard. Can you find them? She held out an envelope that looked porky as a milk-fed puppy. I'll see what I can do. Say, do I get a name? Call me Noosh. With that, she put on her hat and left. I began where I unraveled most of the tricky tangles, with the Rorden gang, better known to the general public as the librarians at the LA Public Library. I knew most of them by name, and they were as sharp as they were helpful. I saw Nora poring over a thick volume and sidled up to the counter. As the library got a Chevalier Audubon, 1840, the auburn curls raised quickly, and her green eyes went from surprised to amused in a flash. She wrinkled her button nose at me. Not today, but if you come in Thursday, we'll see what the fishmonger brings. I explained my quest, and she rolled her eyes. I think you need Layla. Follow me. I love it when I get to go behind the counter, like I've given the right password for the most exclusive speakeasy. This time I not only got behind the counter, but down the hall to the mysterious chambers behind the old murals. Layla looked like Central Casting's idea of the new Theta Bara. Her eyes were black as the coal that encircled them, and her skin was so pale it almost seemed to have a bluish tinge. But within a few moments she had a bunch of books pulled to educate me on les grands transparents and their habit of meddling in human history, as she put it. And yes, from time to time people have done their best to influence or persuade them. It usually goes badly. I looked at the wreckage left behind in what was apparently a remote part of the Yeniseisk Governorate just after the turn of the century. I guess people don't get the message to keep their own ball and jacks. Rumors abound. Have you ever noticed the little shop on Sunset near Fairfax? A ball and mitt racket mostly, but a group meets in the back room there. Might know something. I checked out the place that afternoon. The lights were out and the close sign turned around, but I wasn't after a palm reading anyway. Hammering on the door a few minutes finally roused the proprietor, who clearly suspected the worst of me. We're closed, announced the mystic Waldo. I'm not here for crystal gazing. I want to know if you can get me an inn with some folks around here, I asked nicely, I swear. He looked me up and down. Sorry, but you don't look the sort. Looks aren't everything. You look like you were worried I was the landlord. I am the landlord. That's why I can be picky. He sighed and opened the door for me to enter. You can step into my office. I followed him back to the kitchenette behind the velvet curtains. It was refreshingly bright and the coffee smelled good. Sorry if I woke you. He yawned and laughed, sticking his hands into the pocket of his purple woolen robe. The consulting room was the usual tat and tourist trade stuff, but it must do well enough to afford swanky clothes and a well-appointed kitchen, including a gleaming silex. I'm always up late with the club. I own that, too. I tried to hide my surprise. The Nightingale. You lead a charmed life indeed. Clubs that welcomed all types and that jazzy avant-garde music had a tendency to be hammered regularly by the flatfoots from downtown on the flimsiest of pretexts, just because people having a good time with one another always put their collective nose out of joint. His gaze seemed to take my measure. One thing about the spook racket, you do gather a lot of information that comes in handy. It must be some good information to keep the chief of police sweating, I said with genuine admiration. I'm here for some information myself. You seem to be a man who appreciates frankness, so let me be frank." He laughed. "I'm happy to be earnest, if I can. What is it?" "What do you know about the Great Invisibles? I hear you have a group that might meet here." He poured some coffee into china cups and saucers, adding a dollop of dairy from an antique silver creamer shaped like a cow to his own. My Aunt Dahlia had one just like it. "We did have a group." Past tense. "A certain Frater Ripley led the group. I allowed them to meet for a time. He was not so much charming as useful. At first it was fine, a few rituals and robes, an orgy or whatnot, that was fine. But when he began the summonings, I had to draw a line under it. There are enough earthquakes as it is," he added. "Any idea where they moved to?" "Supposedly some caves in the back of Griffith Park. They meet under the dark moon to summon the great ones. Been going on a couple of months now, no idea what they do in between." "Any idea where to find this Ripley character?" "No, but I believe the true believers gather at the observatory before they hike up into the hills on propitious night." "When's the next dark moon?" Waldo put his hands together as if he were praying and closed his eyes. "Tomorrow night the moon will be black," he said in a deep voice full of portent. "Is there a trick to knowing that?" I asked, unsettled despite myself. He laughed and pointed with his chin. "There's a moon calendar on the wall there. I'm a professional." Noosh hadn't left me any way to get in touch, and she hadn't stopped by since the first day. So after sending off a few letters with incriminating photos to clients, I decided to get some rest in my little rabbit hutch on Normandy. I'd need it if I was going to face some crazy cultists the next night. My dreams kept me restless in the night, as if I felt the invisibles poking me in my bed. Maybe I was part of their plans, or maybe a fly in the ointment. The next evening, before the sun went down, I found myself up in the grand old park that the so-called colonel had given to the city. The Griffith Observatory was a grand white palace that always made me think of postcards of the Taj Mahal. I figured if people were gathering, they would be coming in cars. Did anyone walk in Los Angeles anymore? After all, they were bound to be people with at least some cash. You didn't get much from fleecing the poor, though that didn't keep people from trying. I was worried I might stick out like a sore thumb hanging around, but it seems the place was a regular mecca for the teens. I might have looked like an old creep to them, true, but it was easy to hang around having a smoke without drawing too much attention. I kept my eyes peeled under the lid of my pork pie. My reward came when I spotted a couple of well-heeled folks trotting from the parking lot toward the hiking path instead of toward the building itself. Their attire did not suggest hill walking. The gentleman carried a holdall, quite out of character with his Brooks Brothers suit. They halted for a moment when hailed by another fellow, likewise burdened. Heads together, they exchanged some words before proceeding down the path. I stubbed out my cigarette and, with hands in my pockets, sauntered in the same direction. I had no need to keep them in sight, as another gaggle passed me up on the path as I paused to light another coffin nail. This bunch of women had at least taken the wilderness into consideration and wore tennis togs. Either that or they'd just come from the country club. They, too, carried little bags. Ritual garb, burnt offerings, it was hard to say. Maybe the bags were stuffed with cash for Frater Ripley. Down the path, up through the trees, away generally to the west of the observatory, it seemed, if my sense of direction had not deserted me. Maybe they had a clearing in the woods or... No. I saw them take a turn and seem to disappear. As I cautiously approached, casting an eye over my shoulder to be sure no one was coming up behind me, I peered over an outcropping of rocks. Sure enough, there was a cave opening. Maybe it was a distant part of the Bronson Caves if they stretched this far. This one hadn't appeared in any Zorro or Captain Marvel film. Those rocky entrances were down below in the canyon by the old quarries. I stubbed out my cigarette and weighed my options. In for a penny, I guess. I ducked in the entrance, ready to make up some kind of story, but there was no one in sight. The small cave opened at the back, and there were a series of torches burning, leading away into the distance. While the corridor was strewn with large rocks and boulders, someone had taken the trouble to clear a slim path through the rubble to follow those lights into the belly of the mountain. What could I do but follow? I stepped with care to avoid dislodging any loose stones, and my eyes adjusted to the dim light. I could smell fresher air ahead, and sure enough, the passage opened into a large natural chamber from which arose the murmur of voices, the natural sound of an audience waiting on the main event. I ducked behind a largish rock just where the path sloped down into the main room, and hoped that all eyes would be focused on joining their pals. A line of torches lit what seemed to pass for a stage in this chamber. A few women bustled about, obviously getting things ready. These men always found exploitable dames, the ones sure they were special exceptions to the general contempt for their sex. Their delusion only lifted when it was too late. But where was the frater himself? Backstage cackling, no doubt. The hubbub continued as more people arrived, most eyes immediately going to the stage as they entered the space, which kept them from looking my way. One or two glanced at me, but seeing nothing of interest, walked on. The buzz of excitement grew, that strange electricity that developed when folks gathered with anticipation for something special. Were they here to worship Frater Ripley, or the invisible giants of old? One of the women on stage, clad in diaphanous white silks, played notes from a small glockenspiel. As if on cue, the audience began to hum in unison. The hair on the back of my neck rose. There was nothing extraordinary about the humming itself, but something about the echo of it in that chamber and the blissful expressions of the audience, or should I say, congregation, gave me the heebie-jeebies. The tension in the room needed to break. Of course, that signaled the arrival of Frater Ripley. I couldn't for sure say where he came from, but the puff of smoke was pure vaudeville, so it didn't matter. He cut an interesting figure. Red robes that looked straight from the soundstage of Madame Satan, matched with weird face paint that made his visage look like a mask with Kabbalistic symbols. I don't know what I expected when he opened his mouth. Maybe the clarion voice of Amy Semple McPherson or the passion of Eugene Debs. At first it seemed unremarkable, barely loud enough to be heard. But as the humming died down, it seemed to catch fire, though it was little more than platitudes about a better life, transcendence, and some malarkey about interplanetary vibrations. Then suddenly he was speaking Latin. I think. I don't know. It was all Greek to me. The congregation put on their robes, I was right about those holdalls, and lit candles as part of the ritual. More Latin, more humming, more glockenspiel. My head was beginning to throb with the din of it in that chamber, large as it was. I wondered how often they did this. It must take a lot out of them and all. It must have been the heat or the noise that caused the air to ripple like the sun in the desert. My stomach tied in knots. The crowd pressed forward in waves, queuing before the fearless leader to have their foreheads marked with the oil of the righteous or something like that. Each one he marked with his inky thumb wheeled away in ecstatic rapture. The humming got louder. My head was spinning. I needed to get out of there before I passed out. And then a crack opened in the wall behind Frater Ripley. Light poured out from it, as if it were escaping the night. I had the sense of enormous eyes blinking slowly and a hum to match the congregation's humming sound, and yet one that so dwarfed it as to render it ridiculous. The mountain trembled. Rocks shifted under my feet where I crouched. I did not fear exposure of my hiding place as much as I did being crushed by the stones coming down around our ears. I saw, and yet I did not see. I cannot explain it. Perhaps I only sensed what was there. They were too large for the space, nevertheless contained by it as if something they simply deigned to do. Their presence could obliterate us all, but they chose to spare us for the moment. They were certainly enormous, and yet how could something unseen have size? Vibrations. That was why they did the humming, I understood belatedly. The creatures were summoned by the sound. Creatures? Beings? What word suited them? None. I never understood what people got from churches, a hand to hold in the dark, an imaginary friend, but at that moment I understood awe and the way it could make a man sink to his knees, not so much in fear, but with a feeling he could be no more than a bug to something other than himself. Men like me who lived every day with a smug sense of being on top of the food chain, like we have a handle on life and a weapon in our pockets. We were ants to them. And yet, they came to meet these deluded folks who summoned them in ignorance, in arrogance, in hope, maybe, some of them at least. Not that Frater Ripley, swanning around in self-importance, sure of himself. He seemed to think he would be in charge of this moment. They lifted him into the air as if literally weighing his character. He was found wanting, I guess. An unseen hand snuffed him out as if he were no more than a puff of smoke. Was he dead, or had they just transported him to another world? The effect on the congregation seemed to be divided. Some rushed forward as if to join his fate, while others plunged away in animal panic. The great hands, if they were hands, sent forth a crackle of electricity. At first I thought it was just random, like static filling the room, and looked for something metal to ground myself. As I stared, I finally noticed that the threads of electricity shooting around the dark chamber, most of the congregants had dropped their candles in the panic, they were traveling from forehead to forehead, linking each one by the mark there. Was it the substance he used or some symbol that created the link? Who could know? But my panic reduced when I thought of my own blank slate from temple to temple with nothing more than a thick veneer of flop sweat at the moment. Apparently they were all connected in a trice, for they suddenly rose as one, suspended by the electric net, and like a maid flapping a sheet in the sunshine, they all blinked away at once. I didn't know any of them, but I couldn't help but feel a stab of pity in my heart for all those lives snapped out in an instant. Phone calls never returned, beds empty, and maybe some children somewhere, suddenly orphans. It was awful. Then the eyes were upon me. How many eyes there were, I could not say. I could feel panic rising up like a red tide of blood, drowning coherent thought, and the enormous hands feeling me, and all at once they were talking to me. Not words exactly, not that I would know, and yet I understood all they were saying, and blessing whoever that they understood I was not part of the congregation, that I had not summoned them in superciliousness, but was here by mistake, only a mistake. I didn't know, I didn't want to know, and yet they made me know, made me see. And I could hear myself screaming when they said I could not see and know them. I held my breath, expecting to blink away any second, but instead there was an enormous flash of light and crackle of electricity, and I was falling, hearing snapping bones, and then a crash to my head, and all was at last dark, nothing. I could smell the hospital before I opened my eyes. Then I discovered I couldn't open my eyes. They were tightly bandaged. I stirred, then groaned with sudden pain in my right leg and my left arm. They're broken, the arm and leg, that is. I knew that voice. Noosh, I croaked. Yeah. I felt a soft hand placed on my forehead above the bandages on my eyes. You got knocked around pretty badly, but apart from that, it's not too bad. Am I lying? I tried to get the words out calmly, but my voice cracked a little on the last word. There wasn't much of a call for blind investigators as far as I knew, but then, what did I know? The doctor shrugged and said this and that, but the night nurses gabby sort and told me there didn't seem to be any permanent damage to the nurse. I laughed. What you lack in bedside manner you make up for in good dope. You ever think of pursuing the investigation racket? I heard her light a cigarette. She drew a lungful and then put the tip between my lips. I inhaled gratefully before she took it away again. Thanks. You found them. It wasn't a question. Noosh tried to disguise the excitement in her voice. You don't want to find them, I told her, knowing I was wasting my breath. They wiped out an entire congregation of true believers in the snap of your fingers. They don't want to be contacted, your great invisibles. Leave them alone. I can't do that. We need them more than ever now. Noosh took another puff, and I could feel the smoke waft over me. The war is over, but a new one is beginning. It hides behind doors and windows. It is hard to find, to stop. We need their help. Then trust that they will give it. I couldn't explain how I knew it. I just did. Don't tell them their business. She laughed. Who's a true believer now? I didn't say anything. I didn't have the words. I could hear her shoes shift on the hospital tiles. There's a place in Mexico. They say the veils between worlds are thin there. I hope to make contact. Maybe you... I shook my head. I'm not going to look for them, and I hope they won't come looking for me. There are just some things we are too small to get involved in. We have plenty to do in this life. If you change your mind, come down to La Huasteca. It's a region on the Gulf. They say it's full of magic. I think I've had my fill of magic for a while. She leaned over and kissed my forehead. In war as in peace, as Clemenceau said, those who never give up have the last word. You can have it, and I will let les grands transparents have their peace. They have earned it. Noosh sighed and walked away. I listened to the click of her heels until it disappeared down the hallway. Too bad. I'd miss her. She was smart and a stunner. Someone ought to paint her. I could hear the play-by-play coming from a radio in a room nearby. The Brooklyn Dodgers were going to go all the way to the top of the league this season. I had a feeling. Someone was looking out for them for sure. I shivered. You never know who it might be. Daylight was only a dream for me now, but I could feel it on my arm. I was always saying I needed more rest. Might as well try to get some shut-eye. Maybe when I woke up, everything would hurt a little less. But they would still be out there, watching us. Mm-hmm.